Hey everyone, welcome to the Candidates podcast. Today we have a special. We are going legal. I'm Man Wong, and co-hosting with me is John Jacobs. We are joined by our guest James Keogh, a partner and employment lawyer at Knights PLC. James has been practicing law since 2007 and has a broad range of employment law expertise. He's a trusted advisor to many well-known businesses, focused particularly within retail, manufacturing, and food sectors. We're thrilled to have him, and we're very excited to be speaking with him today. John, James, how are you both?
Good, thanks, man.
Yeah, good.
Thank you, man.
Keeping dry out of the rain?
Yeah, just about.
Just before we get into it, a bit more about your background, James. John, please tell the listeners your idea on the show and what we're hoping to achieve.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, man. I think, as always, our goal at Candidate X is looking at ways we can better add value, support our community of followers, how we can better serve them, and even more so, I suppose, in the current climate. So, as is well documented, diverse groups continue to fight that little bit harder to be heard, to overcome barriers, break down obstacles, fight systemic blockers, etc. All of these things preventing them from furthering their careers and realising their ambitions. So I think today's surgery with James is particularly pertinent, as we're sitting within a very precarious moment with the UK unemployment rates. And I suspect from all that I've been reading that the rate of unemployment is going to be rising pretty rapidly once this furlough scheme is going to grind to a halt in October. There's all sorts of news stories that have been coming out in the past couple of weeks, particularly around, there was one hotel receptionist role advertised in Manchester I saw that received nearly 1,000 applications within a 24-hour period of the job going live. For a position, I might add, that the hotel manager said normally gets about 15 applications. And the real scary part is the amount of overqualified staff that have been applying to that position. So, where we're sitting at the moment, we're seeing unemployment rise last month by 74,000. We're seeing 650,000 fewer people on payrolls than before the crisis, according to official figures. And as we're seeing, vacancies are a record low, and working hours have also tumbled, according to the Office for National Statistics. So there's going to be a lot of concerned individuals out there at the moment, people that are either actively job seeking at the moment as a result of redundancy, or who are currently furloughed and pretty fearful of the fact they may well lose their job in the coming months. And if you're going to add to this fear, I suppose, the lens of discrimination and prejudice, certainly within hiring processes, and unfair constructive dismissals perhaps that are disguised as redundancies, you can start to see, I suppose, where we have had so many people reaching out to us for advice and support on this matter at the moment. So James, welcome to the show. I imagine we may well only just scratch the surface today on a few things, but let's see how much ground we can cover. Before we get into it, do you want to give our listeners a quick overview of yourself and your expertise and your background, and let's start asking some questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks both for having me. Just in terms of my background, then, so I had what you'd probably traditionally describe as a working class upbringing in Essex, and I was fortunate enough to pass my 11 plus exam to go to grammar school, and then went on to study law at Leeds University. And when I was there, I had quite a lot of knockbacks initially in applying for graduate schemes within law firms. Law firms, very traditional businesses and highly competitive, and they historically looked purely at academics, really, rather than more well-rounded personalities for their graduates. That is something which has started to change. Maybe we can go on to talk about that a bit later on, or a different episode of the podcast. But I eventually managed to secure myself a training contract with a larger international law firm, where I eventually qualified as an employment lawyer. I'm fascinated by people, really, and kind of what drives them and their decision making. And for me, before I went to university, it was a toss up between studying psychology and law. And so I think it was pretty natural, really, that I went on to be interested in employment law, which is, after all about people. And after after practicing as a lawyer at this international law firm, I recently joined Knights. So, Man mentioned them earlier. It's a fast-growing, exciting legal services business. Not traditional, so we've moved away from a traditional law firm partnership structure and focus less on individualism and more on teamwork and looking out for each other, which is quite refreshing, really, for a legal services business. And they've got a lot of cultural values that I can identify with, really. That's what attracted me to working there. In terms of my role, I advise businesses and individuals, really, on a full spectrum of workplace issues and disputes that touch on areas of employment law. So, from all stages of the employment cycle, really, recruitment level to training, conduct issues, grievances, training, termination of employment, essentially any area of potential workplace conflict, really, I assist with. In employment law is a sort of ever-changing area of the law, really. John, you mentioned the furlough scheme before, and I mean that's all new law, right? So you've got having to advise both individuals and employers around the various facets of that is a challenge in itself, and I think that's probably what keeps it interesting, really, for me, in terms of my advice. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a background to me.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, James. Yeah, I think it's an interesting time, isn't it? To be for someone who's in your position and your role, as you say, irrespective of the kind of 15 years of legal practice that you've been doing in various positions and specific in the employment law, the landscape's changing. Furloughs are quite a common thing, as I understand it, in the US, but over here it's not really done. Maybe on the contractor space that John and I used to work in the agency model, we used to hand out furloughs to contractors, but not to this scale and degree. And we're really interested in the impact here. And we've got some specific questions that we want to move towards into the show from various listeners that have some queries around their situations, which we hope we can shed some light. But starting a bit more generally, James, I'm interested in terms of employment law. So what trends have you seen at this stage in time, and how much has COVID and movements from societal identification such as Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, cause and influence this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's generally a greater awareness, I think, of employment rights, and I think the internet and the quality of content on there has certainly helped to for individuals to be able to get access to high quality information about their rights. In terms of more recent developments, the Me Too movement and the gender pay gap reporting that's sat alongside that, really, it meant that I think that there was a sort of feeling of increasing confidence amongst female workers in terms of speaking out about oppressions and barriers in the workplace. And then, in addition to that, I think mental health has certainly been an emerging area and more of awareness of mental health issues and how they're impacting on people's jobs. So I think employers are being more willing to support employees with mental health problems and encouraging them to come forward and trying to increase levels of awareness across management populations within business as well is something that we're seeing as a trend, and that obviously can only be a good thing. And then more recently with the Black Lives Matter movement as well, and the ethnicity pay reporting that looks like it's certainly going to be coming into force. I think that's certainly, again, an increased focus on employment rights and people feeling more confident to speak out about both in terms of decision making in the workplace, whether that be conscious or unconscious, and then also sort of various different levels of harassment as well. And we might be able to go and talk about that, but from overt harassment to sort of more cases of microaggression, which I know is quite an American term, but it's increasingly coming into the vocabulary here in this country. And I think all of these things are good to, they're very good points to be flushed out, I think, in the UK economy and in the employment space, because these things should be spoken about and should be addressed, and should, in general, these kind of employment law issues and employee rights, discrimination, equality is just far higher up now on the agenda of boards in UK businesses, and that can only be a positive for everyone concerned, really.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on a few things there that are of interest. I think, certainly from my experience, talking about mental health issues, the response to the Me Too campaign, and people a bit more willing, and companies a bit more open to listening to complaints and taking them much more seriously than maybe before. We've, in my experience, and I entered the workplace in 2006, so 15 years, and I've seen a huge change in attitude into these sorts of things. I think there was a real sense of you're weak if you are feeling fatigued or worn down or mentally drained, and you daren't in old environments we used to work in, you daren't say that you feel mentally unwell for the fear of having repercussions with your own career path and your promotion opportunities, because it was weak to be seen to be suffering in any way, shape or form, which of course is completely daft. As human beings, you go through a roller coaster of emotions. There's all sorts of things that can affect it, from family life, etc. So the fact that companies are more open and set up to discussing these problems, or having support networks and company benefits set up to support individuals now is encouraging. Have you seen an increase then in companies setting themselves up to really support their staff much more so? And I mean, obviously we're of a similar age, James, so have you seen an improvement in that level in the years you've spent in the industry so far?
Yeah, and I think part of that is businesses being there to support staff who come forward with issues, create an environment where people can be completely open and candid, and not in fear of the repercussions of coming forward with issues, which is obviously important. But twinned with that is employers really encouraging managers and also incentivizing management to be good in terms of their support of staff that come forward. So
welfare, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like empathy used to be considered to be a weakness amongst managers, whereas now as a quality in itself is regarded as a strength. And educational programs really for managers and employees, educating people, creating an environment where people were really educated about themselves. Why do you react in the way you do to others? How different people's brains work under pressure, and why we find fault rather than looking to praise, and generally how it's possible to rewire your brain. All of these things are actually extremely important, both for managers and staff. And I think employers are investing a lot more time, money, and effort in making sure that they're introducing training and setting time aside for these things. And let's hope that that doesn't stop due to the cost pressures businesses are going to be put under due to COVID. Let's hope not.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think so. You said there's a few points there, Jay, and yourself covered, and it sounds like there's this inflection point where technology has enabled a much more scalable and access to information, so people are much more aware of perhaps certainly movements, such as the BLM, Me Too, the pay gap issues that keep sort of bouncing around and discussed, but also a bit more ability to research what the legal rights are that you may have that can challenge certain situations or that you may find yourself in. Do you think then, James, is the law in tune with that as such? Because obviously a lot of employment law, we'll get into a bit more about protected characteristics, for instance, but the law that's been created is updated enough to deal with some of the changes that are happening in the societal sense that we may be prone to sort of areas of discrimination still, or do you think it needs some work still to kind of not modernize but keep up with it?
Well, I think the legal framework in this country is very particularly on discrimination and protecting groups of the population. I think is very sophisticated actually, and employees do have access to justice. I mean, it was only a few years ago now that the UK government abolished employment tribunal fees based on a challenge from the Unison trade union. And what that did was it enabled access to justice, people to be able to bring claims without having to, in an employment tribunal, to enforce their rights without having to incur a cost. And that's just one example, really, of how people do have access to justice in this country. And there are various different forms of discrimination legislation and rights that people have in order to protect their interests that maybe in other countries they would struggle to bring claims and know how to go about it, or the costs involved would mean that it was prohibitive for them to do so. So I mean, there are some other areas, for example, such as unfair dismissal, where an employee would have to have 2 years service in order to bring a claim, where you might argue, that prevents access to justice. But certainly in specific areas such as discrimination, where it's a day one right for an individual, that certainly I feel like there is enough protection there. And actually the potential compensatory awards that people can be issued by an employment tribunal are uncapped. So it's a very serious issue for an employer that ends up in that position, and that's quite right. It's quite right that the repercussions should be as serious as they are.
It's interesting, isn't it? So it sounds like the law is pretty fair, is the right word, I guess. In certainly in favour of the employee. Certainly once you're in the organisation and working, and then you talk about discrimination being a day one thing. Obviously, you can be discriminated obviously before you even work for an organisation, right? It can be done on the application stage and on the sourcing element there. I think for the benefit of the users, I'd like to talk a little bit about the sort of protected characteristics aspect there, where discrimination can be directly appraised upon. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding around that, please?
Yeah, sure. So under the Equality Act, there's various groups of population that are protected from discrimination, essentially less favourable treatment. And so they are age, disability, race, nationality, religious or philosophical belief, gender, sexual orientation, maternity and pregnancy. I think I've probably got all of them there. But yeah, if you have any of those characteristics and you can establish that you do, which in most of the cases is a relatively simple exercise. Disability is the one where perhaps that's something which is often subject to challenge. But if you possess one of those characteristics, then you are able to assert your rights not to be treated less favourably on account of those characteristics. And have protection from various forms of discrimination. So, and that discrimination can take various forms. So, direct discrimination, where someone's sort of directly treated less favourably on account of their age. So, for example, I may not have got a job because I'm too old. Versus indirect discrimination, where it is less overt. So, for example, it might be a redundancy selection criteria that it's a last in, first out, and that indirectly discriminates against younger people. So that is a form of indirect discrimination, albeit that indirect discrimination can be potentially justified by the employer in certain situations. To other forms of discrimination, such as harassment or victimization. So there is one other form, which is positive, to implement reasonable adjustments for disabled people as well. So there are all these different forms of discrimination based on an individual having a protected characteristic, really. So I think but it's all of these rights are and ways of asserting them it's a very complicated area, and I think that's the challenge probably for individuals to be getting the right amount, the sort of quality legal advice that they might need in order to take their claims forward. And ultimately there are trade unions, but they don't extend to every group of employees within every business. So it can sometimes be a challenge, although individuals do have access to employment tribunals and rights. It's often a challenge for them to get the right level of advice that they need.
James, I mean, one of the things of just listening to you there, I imagine you talked about microaggressions, and on a similar theme, a lot of the things you've just discussed, many companies aren't overtly doing these things, discriminating in those ways. It's a lot of subtle things that you might suspect. You may not have hard evidence, should we say, when accusing your employer or former employer of some of these things. So is that something you see quite a lot, where people come to you and say, I suspect it was because I'm gay, I suspect it's because I suffer from poor mental health at times, or I suspect it's because I recently came back from maternity leave, etc., etc. But you can't necessarily you don't necessarily have any hard evidence or fact to draw upon in order of bringing back some claims on this.
Yeah, it is absolutely, and I think that is, it's microaggression is probably a good example of that, really, in terms of it's a problem across all sorts of industries. As you say, John, subtle, slight reaction that can leave people from a minority group from feeling upset, offended, or uncomfortable. And often the person delivering that action is kind of really unaware of that impact, and hasn't never intended it to be that way. And ultimately that is a form of workplace harassment. It's about the impact on the individual rather than necessarily what was intended, and the law does protect the individual in that respect. But it can be sort of still quite a bit of a hurdle to overcome for somebody to establish that they are not being hypersensitive, and that there is something in it, and there are often, it's helpful for them to be able to draw on facts that over a period of time that have led them to feel that way, and that it's maybe not just that person that's been impacted, and there are others as well. And often what you'll find is, there is a time, if there is a good case for an individual to have, there's often a time limit. There's often a timeline or a series of events and facts that do, when pulled together, do go to suggest that there has been foul play, really, or some kind of workplace harassment or discrimination that's taken place, and it's something often which you can only really flush out in an employment tribunal environment and allow somebody independent, like a judge, to make a deliberation on it once they've heard all the evidence. Really, it's often not obvious.
No, absolutely. So I imagine advice then for people that are feeling that they have been marginalised in one of these ways is to, I suppose, collect data and information, no matter how small they may deem it, and over a collection, of events or time, you may well have something that can point towards discrimination in one of these categories, right?
Yeah, that's right, and that's true. I think on both sides. So if you're an individual and you feel that you've been subjected to any of this kind of treatment, unlawful treatment in the workplace, then absolutely it's important for you to gather evidence of that and to make a record of it, because ultimately that paper trail and that record is your evidence, that you is part of your evidence anyway, that you would be potentially asking an employment tribunal to assess further down the line. But the same goes for the employer as well, where if you feel that you've done everything right on behalf of a member of staff and that they are being hypersensitive and they have taken it the wrong way, and maybe you feel that it's unjust of them to be kicking off with you, then the same goes for the employer as well, in terms of keeping that paper trail so that you can establish to an employment tribunal that you have treated the employee reasonably, and that you haven't done anything wrong, and it's the same applies there, absolutely.
So it's interesting. Sorry, man. I'm just, we're interested. We're talking about cases of, redundancies and things that affect employees. But at the top of this podcast, we discussed briefly the unemployment levels and the amount of job seekers that are flooding onto the market at the moment. And for people that are sending their CVs into job applications, it's very, very hard to prove that you've been discriminated against because of anything on your CV, right? So are you seeing companies doing more to protect or to be overt about how they decide on their hiring processes with regards to CV reviews and the incoming applications, more so than the outgoing people, which we've just discussed?
Yes, I've seen that, and I think that is important. And I think it ultimately that comes from the top, right? Doesn't it? It needs to be an issue. Discrimination and unconscious bias in recruitment needs to be absolutely something which is, as we discussed before, on the agenda of the board and seen as being a priority. If that flows from the top, really, and then if that can become a priority for a business, then often you'll find that they can create ways to ensure as much as they possibly can. There's no way of eliminating unconscious bias, but to go as far as they possibly can to be able to introduce measures, such as trying to anonymise CVs as much as you possibly can when they're put before the recruiting managers. Things like that is very important to protect the individuals, protect the business, but also create the right kind of environment that means that you're going to attract the right kind of talent, really, to your business.
I'm curious, with all this kind of the changes in society with the social identity and the movements that are around this, have you seen your caseload increase? Because things like Me Too highlighted these areas. Women are becoming more empowered, not just women, but anybody that's been a victim of any sort of sexual assault or harassment is more open to sort of voicing their concerns and their experiences, and also with BLM being so prominent at the moment, are you finding a lot more those sort of cases coming to the forefront on your workload as well?
Yeah, absolutely. A higher, I'd say, we haven't seen a massive increase in a caseload, investigation caseload. Certainly a higher proportion of cases relating to matters such as sexual harassment and racial discrimination. I think that's only, going to increase. What we are seeing as well, a spike of, is data subject access requests as well from individuals since
I bet, yeah.
of GDPR. Because to John's point earlier, in terms of one of the areas an individual can obviously gather information about themselves is to be able to make formal requests to the business for copies of emails and other information about themselves, to be able to find out, how is information about me being processed within the business. And often those data subject access requests can lead to an individual actually to them receiving information that validates some of those suspicions that they may have had from their day-to-day dealing. So certainly an increase in those that is sort of, it shows there should be an increased focus for businesses in making sure you get it right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of social media activity that I witness is kind of really bipartisan. There's the area where people feel, okay, because of these movements and everything that's captured on this side, people are much more prone to playing the race card, quote unquote, and likewise, people that want to voice something are quite often what's termed as gaslight. They're gaslight lit, where people just sort of try and extinguish any of those concerns by saying that's not what these people meant, or taking it out of context, all this sort of stuff. So it's interesting to see, these different polar positions that it has had some inspiration and led, I guess, how I'd like to view it is that people feel more comfortable in sort of raising their hands and talking about it, and actually seeing the ability to find a legal resource, in order to validate this piece. And things like GDPR, as you mentioned, with this with a subject access request, can really sort of help them, validate these suspicions, as you say, really.
Yeah, and I think that there's, to your point there, I think there's basically an outdated view, really, that a focus on these issues within businesses and at board level could, and introducing training for employees on things like unconscious bias and harassment, that could increase sensitivity and thereby actually potentially increase conflict in the workplace. It's been queried in the past whether it encourages a belief, that one group of people is always the aggressor and another group are the victim. But that's a very outdated concept now, as you say, and I think that there's an increasing recognition that there are significant benefits in focusing on creating the type of environment, that you describe, where people can come forward and be open, honest, and transparent. And actually, if you're able as a business to do those things, then you'll attract a more diverse and talented workforce, really.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to sort of capture how the current landscape is. So it certainly seems that it feels to me that organizations are trying to modernize, they're trying to keep up with these societal identifications that people are having, and how to match them and provide support for them in the right way. And the legal industry is adapting in the way also enabled to make the services accessible for them so they can gain the support in the areas that they need. Moving on to a bit more of the specific questions that we've had through, now that we've got your time here, Jimmy. First one I've wanted to ask you was, so there's a certain situation, one of the listeners shot a question across, was, if I'm asked to take a pay reduction during the situation with COVID, what are my rights, and can I say no?
Yeah, so I mean, if an employer is seeking to reduce your pay, as with any other sort of material change to your term and condition of your employment, they would need to do so with your agreement, unless they already had a contractual right to make variations. And quite often, employers will not have a contractual right to reduce your pay. So they would, if they're going to do it lawfully, make that kind of change, they would need to do it with your agreement. but it is possible for an employer, if they don't have your agreement, to do that, to be able to implement a process that we call dismissal and re-engagement. So if they believe that the change is necessary for business reasons and that they can support that, and that they've consulted with you over trying to get your explicit acceptance to the change to their pay, then and you haven't been forthcoming with your acceptance, then they can go through a process of consulting with you over potentially dismissing you for your failure to accept the new change, and then offering you re-engagement on the revised package. And now that is a process that can enable an employer to lawfully dismiss you, but they need, in going through that process, as with any other termination of employment, they would need to do so, go through a reasonable process, following all the necessary steps, but also have a good reason and sound reason for the change, really. So it's important that an individual in that situation understands that either they would have to agree to it voluntarily, or the employer is duty bound to consult with them first before introducing anything without your agreement.
So in essence, if as you said, nothing in the contract, unless they've got a provision in there in the first place, means they can automatically do this anyhow, they need to go through a consultation process with the individual, and they can choose to accept or not. If they choose to not to accept, then another recourse that the organisation could do with them is to do the dismissal and re-engagement piece that you mentioned there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Cool. Moving on from there, sort of more generally speaking, from someone else, is in pursuing an employment dispute, what are my legal options? You mentioned obviously sort of tribunals and things like that earlier in the conversation. What else is at their disposal?
Well, it's important for anyone who has a serious issue in the workplace that they want to raise, and they feel maybe the subject of an employment tribunal claim, to first raise that internally. And often an individual can feel, well, that's not going to get me anywhere because this is the same business that have mistreated me. But ultimately, you should be raising that issue as a grievance, really, and then it's incumbent upon the business to ensure that somebody impartial and at the right level addresses that grievance in accordance with the requirements in the Acas Code of Practice. So it's important as a first port of call to articulate that in a grievance and put that in writing and send it through the necessary route within the organisation. And then if that doesn't give you a satisfactory outcome, then it's a necessary precursor to bring in an employment tribunal claim for the individual to go to Acas, who are an independent organisation set up by the government, who are there to resolve workplace conflict. So it's incumbent upon the individual to go to Acas first to see if they could try to explore essentially like an out-of-court resolution without the need for an employment tribunal claim to be brought. And at any stage and then Acas will then contact the employer and try to see. Often, the resolution sought by the individual is a financial resolution. But it may be also that they would like reinstatement or some other kind of non-monetary resolution to the conflict, and Acas can help to try to broker a deal there. But at any stage during this process, the individual can obtain legal advice. They could go to the Citizens Advice Bureau to see if they can help support them as well. So, there are various stages that are designed to try to give both parties an opportunity to resolve their issue without needing to put a further burden on what is already a very busy and taxpayer-funded employment tribunal system.
Yeah, Acas, for the benefit of the listeners, is the Advisory Conciliation Arbitration Service, right? And as you say, they're a third party on behalf of the government to resolve these sort of issues here. Is that quite a common recourse? Because I imagine if you've got an employment issue internally, right, and it's specifically with your manager, for instance, if you had to go through the necessary internal routes, you may not get the desired outcomes that you want, right? And it can cause quite a lot of friction in your day-to-day job otherwise.
Yeah, and I think the Acas website is a very useful resource, I think, both for employers and employees. It contains a lot of general information in there about work rights and necessary processes for employers and employees to go through. And I would recommend if anyone that has an issue along the lines of what we discussed during this podcast, that that they don't wait to go on the Acas website until the point when they get thinking about lodging an employment tribunal claim. Do that much earlier, because it will help inform your next steps. And maybe help you to frame, what it is that you want to say, and to help you articulate that to your employer in such a way that it might be able to get you the outcome that you desire, really. And equally from the employer side, it's important to look at that, to consider how you respond to any issue that's raised as well.
James, I've got something just to ask you. So we, in our experiences, our backgrounds as recruiters, one way that we've seen companies address diversity issues in terms of hiring is by employing positive discrimination tactics, which is an interesting subject. I mean, a lot of companies have been, prejudicing their hiring for X many years, and so you kind of get the psychology of now positively trying to attract more women or more disabled people or more ethnic minorities to come work for their business. But it's a tricky place to be, isn't it? Because then, of course, you are discriminating against everyone else in trying to do that. So have you seen, I suppose, many companies, I mean, what are the rights there in terms of the some of the elements we've discussed in terms of companies being able to do such tactics? Shouldn't it be an equality-focused process rather than an overtly discriminatory one?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's more of a case of, without creating an issue for yourself, potentially, it is important to try to focus on eliminating inequality as opposed to favouring one particular group of the population. And that's the safest thing for an employer to do, rather than having to potentially justify what is an indirectly discriminatory policy that you might have. There are a couple of areas where employers are required to positively discriminate, but they are very specific and targeted points that come out of the Equality Act. So one of those areas being disability, and having a positive duty as an employer to input reasonable adjustments in favour of somebody with a disability. And likewise, the other one is an employee who is on maternity leave, and employers are required to favour that employee for any suitable vacancy that may arise when that employee is made redundant whilst on maternity leave. So there are a couple of these very specific targeted areas in which employers are allowed to positively discriminate. But like you say, I think it's a far more open, transparent, and safer route for an employer to focus on doing everything they can to eliminate inequality.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it's a really interesting juxtaposition for companies, because on the one hand, They are, as you mentioned, being having to do mandatory reporting now on, say, gender pay gap. And then on the other hand, in their efforts to try and bring more female leaders into the business, they are actively trying to discriminate against men for certain roles in order to bring women through. So it's a very challenging position for organisations to be in, particularly those, as we say, with 250 staff or above who have to report on these things. So it's interesting the way that things are going. I mean, you touched upon ethnicity reporting as something that's coming down the line. Do you know much more about when or how likely this sort of thing is going to be to land? I mean, is it going to be this year, next year? Is it on the kind of, I suppose it's going to be fast track given all that's going on at the moment in the world?
Yeah, I think it is. It's certainly going to be something. I'm almost certain that it's going to be something that comes in. It's just a question of when. And all of the practical issues that stem from it probably do need to be thought about a bit more. But it is certainly something which is coming down the line. Allowing employers to be able to get access to that kind of level of data, of course, because it's obviously not as straightforward as gender pay gap reporting. It's far more complicated, and there's lots of data privacy issues and so on that are associated with it that do need to be thrashed out. So I think it's purely only some of those practical points that are preventing this that might prevent it from coming immediately. But all of I think any kind of initiative like that, which is there to promote inclusivity, I think will be firmly on the agenda of the government, and rightly so, really.
Sure. I mean, you touched on data there. I think that's a whole topic for another day, because
we might have to have
there's so many questions that word data triggers in my head, and I'm no doubt the listeners. So you're going to have to come back again, I'm afraid, James, and answer some other questions for us on another day.
Yeah, good plan.
Yeah, no, it's been great chatting to you, James, today, and thanks very much for taking your time to go through some of the bits and pieces with us. It's very interesting.
My pleasure, and I hope you have me back.
100%. I really enjoyed getting to speak on some interesting and important topics. We certainly hope to do a follow-up as we try and keep pace with the changing legal landscape for employees. Thanks, John, for co-hosting. Thanks to those who wrote in with questions. Hope you guys found the topics useful, and please get in touch on our socials if you have any other questions you'd like us to answer or topics to discuss on the legal side. In the meanwhile, be good, be kind, and stay safe, everyone.